Tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou. Tēnā koutou e ngā manahiri, kua tamaine nō ne hau e whā. Tēnā koutou katoa. Nau mai hari mai, ki te tamaki makoro, nō reira tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou, tēnā koutou katoa. What I said was welcome. And welcome to you, the visitors who have come from the four winds. Te reo Māori is a very poetic and beautiful language. So it's an honour, an absolute honour this afternoon to introduce Dr. Dawn Casey as our third keynote for the day, and a day of inspirational kōrero discussion it has been. Before that, I just wanted to mention four small points. Many of you would have already been, I'm very honoured to be the director of Auckland Art Gallery Toi o Tamaki. And many people know it's a very beautiful building. In fact, we won World Building the Year, so other people think it's beautiful too. But in that, it was very clear to me, one is its relationship to the natural environment, to the park. But also, I firmly believe the reason for its great beauty and sensitivity and sensibility is the dimension of Māoridom within that project. And Hārawa, our Māori advisory group, were very involved in the discussions. And when you get to know that building, the Māori dimension, the quality between tapu or sacred and non-tapu or not sacred spaces, the transitions and the integration is very beautiful. I also wanted to mention, just recently we had the Pacific Arts Association conference. Fabulous discussions over those 3 days, a collaboration again with the Auckland Museum. And Tavarism was mentioned quite a lot, the notion of space and time. Albert Rafferty and Hufanga, Dr. Okasitino Mahina from Tonga spoke about time and space from a completely different ontological position. It was revelatory to me and to many people in that room, and I just wanted to reinforce the power of the thinking from this part of the world. I also just wanted to mention with the first exhibition, 3 years ago I came, and Zara Stanhope, who's our principal curator, and I were very keen to show a show called My Country from Queensland Art Gallery. This is where I draw to Dawn. It was astonishing to see the hunger for knowledge about Indigenous communities in Australia, but also the power and the poignancy. There were people in tears in that exhibition every day. It is tremendous what is not known about Indigenous histories in Australia and vice versa. The final thing I wanted to mention is kaitiaki. There is a Maori proverb and a Maori concept meaning custodianship, and the word is kaitiaki. And this changes our whole relationship in museums because we are here as custodians of these objects. They are not ours. And that fundamental shift in ownership, I think, is also fundamental to our relationship with our audience and our work. So, Dr. Dawn Casey, I want to firstly thank very warmly the very new His Excellency High Commissioner Peter Woolcott. He's been here for a very short time and has already made a tremendous impact on Aotearoa New Zealand, and I look forward to working with you further. So, Dawn Casey has been described as tough, determined, principled. Her name is synonymous with brave and indeed a ferocious intelligence. To some, she is known as a person of great distinction, a respected figure, to others, a cultural warrior. There is no doubt, however, that Dr. Dawn Casey is a visionary in the preservation and promotion of Indigenous culture. She's been recognised nationally and internationally for her groundbreaking work as the director of the National Museum of Australia, bringing Indigenous culture into the spotlight and to the masses indeed. She has previously held these positions at the director, as I said, at the National Museum, also of Western Australia and the Powerhouse Museum in Sydney. Her career includes a number of key executive positions in the public sector, including Indigenous Affairs, Cultural Heritage, Overseas Aid, to mention a few. She has numerous honorary doctorates. She is a descendant of the Tagalaka clan from Queensland, which immediately means my affinity with her is deep, being a Queensland girl myself. So I want to warmly welcome you, Dawn. It's a great honour, and this is a day of profound keynotes and tremendous discussion. So please, would you welcome to the stage Dawn Casey. Kia ora.
Well, thank you, Rana. I think some of that introduction continues to get me into trouble. Tanga Kata Whenua people, land of New Zealand. Sorry about the pronunciation. And thank you for that wonderful welcome that we had this morning. I'd also like to acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, past and present, and those people here today, and other Indigenous people who have come from other countries. I'd like to also acknowledge those who continue the struggle for equality and justice. I'd also like to acknowledge and thank Australia's High Commissioner, His Excellency, the High Commissioner to New Zealand, Peter Woolcott. Thank you so much also for funding my participation at the conference, and I do hope I can live up to this worthy gesture. I have to press it. Oh, it's up. I'd also like to acknowledge the Chair of Aotearoa, Roy Clare, and President of Museums Australia, Frank Howarth, the Director of the Maritime Museum, Vincent, and Zara Stanhope, and Philippa and Alex, who've done so much work. Thank you so much, because there's been emails flying back and forwards to everyone. In my address today, my use of museums also includes galleries, and I'm only covering the situation in Australia because I don't believe I have the authority to speak about New Zealand. I would like to stress from the outset that I recognise there is much debate about the meaning of the term social capital. I quite like the description social capital is a form of economic and cultural capital in which social networks of central transactions are marked by reciprocity, trust and cooperation. And for museums, they produce services not mainly for themselves but for the common good. My serious involvement with the museum sector began in the late 80s, a decade prior to a time of dramatic change for the sector internationally. Economic pressures brought about by the ever-increasing operating cost and the requirements by government and boards of trustees to run more cost-effective organisations and commercially oriented accelerated this revolution. Museums including the British Museum, the Metropolitan Museum, the Natural History Museum in New York were among the first to realise the advantages of having shops and cafes, not just to improve the visitor experience, but also to raise a much-needed revenue. New purpose-built museums embracing iconic architecture featuring curved walls and awkward exhibition spaces, incorporating the extensive use of multimedia, joined the list of tourist destinations around the world. There were new museums representing national and international events, both celebratory and horrific, reunification of countries, new national identity, urban regeneration, and the newly found recognition of Indigenous peoples. For me, one of the most interesting changes during this time were the extraordinary shift in museum policies and practices. Conservation moved from a skill traditionally exercised by craftspeople to a profession dealing with increasingly complex scientific procedures and agreed international environmental standards developed for the preservation of collections. Research, scholarship programs and exhibition development, particularly in history museums, were transformed by the intellectual and cultural shift towards inclusiveness to reflect the multicultural nature of society. The work of Kylie Winkworth and Rosalind Russell to develop and publish the Guide to Assessing the Significance of Cultural Heritage Objects and Collections, and Des Griffin and the Council of Museums Association policy, Previous Possessions, New Obligations, were groundbreaking reforms in Australia. The Heritage Collection Council, through its committees on digitisation and conservation, produced several innovative outcomes, including the publication Recollection, Caring for Collections across Australia. And I should mention Martin Hallett, and in one of those first committees leading the work way back then on digitisation. Museums in Canada, United States and Australia began the process of repatriation of Indigenous human remains and secret sacred objects, followed at that time somewhat reluctantly by some museums in the UK. Museum professionals and academics internationally convened conferences and wrote papers examining the roles of museums. The description in Museums Australia's Constitution at section 5.3 is excellent and has stood the test of time. Very early in my career as a director, I further elaborated at the National Museum on what I saw as three major roles. A social role, they represent the culture of a particular society, and by acquiring items of national, local or community significance, they act as a collective memory. They are the repositories of the sum total of everything that is important to us. An educational role and a civic role. The way in which museums carry out their roles is a critical ingredient in building social capital. This was the issue that exercised my thinking when needing to advise the newly elected Howard government in 1996 on whether or not they should maintain their election platform policy to construct a new national museum at a time when cutting thousands of jobs and tens of millions of dollars from programs across the country. The National Museum of Australia would be the government's centenary of the flagship for the project for the Centenary of Federation celebration. It was to be a showcase, not just for Australian history and culture, but for the new way of doing things that the great museums of the world were beginning to demonstrate. Following several parliamentary hearings, I was authorised to proceed with the design and construction with a delivery method called alliancing, a world first. Alliancing was chosen because of the importance for the museum and the Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies staff to be actively involved in the design. As the quality of the project was of the utmost importance, the alliance agreement included a measure of quality to ensure that costs were not minimised at the expense of the design integrity of the building and exhibitions. Both buildings were completed. It's not moving. Both buildings were completed on time and on budget, maintained or even enhanced the original design concept, and achieved the highest possible craftsmanship in all the details and finishes. As with most architecture, there has been and will continue to be criticism of the NMA. However, the building labourers, the architects, engineers, subcontractors alike walked away from that project not only with their bonuses and or profits mostly intact, but also with a pride of being involved in a world first and a once-in-a-lifetime experience. There we go. Can museums be social agents for change? Well, I said it back then and I continue to maintain that they can and they should. We were determined at that time that the content and approach to history of the new National Museum would be equally striking and new. The museum would not just talk about the past, we would be involved with the present and the future as well. We wanted to help our visitors understand Australian history better and by doing so build on that insight to understand the issues of today and influence the nation of the future, a social agent. To this end, curators did amazing work within a very short time frame. One example was the Eternity Gallery, subtitled Stories from the Emotional Heart of Australia. One of Eternity's message was that all of our stories are timeless and that our lives are an important part of Australian history and culture. There were Your Story video booths that offered visitors a chance to contribute their own story to the exhibition, and the response was overwhelming. Visitors shared their stories, stories of tremendous passion, stories of limitless hope and joy. Listening to the stories of people recorded was not unlike seeing a barometer of the national mood. For a period immediately following September 11, 2001, the stories were sombre. A number of people expressed their dismay at the way the world was turning, and they chose to speak about emotions of hope and fear, especially the fear that Australia might find itself once again at war. The same occurred after the Canberra bushfires in 2003, where people lost family members, homes, and personal belongings that had captured their memories. A memory of the powerhouse. I recall walking into my office at the Powerhouse Museum one day and it being no different from the average day for a director, worrying about the budget cuts, efficiency dividends, and in this instance, how staff were going to develop a substantial program for the Design Festival. On my desk, I observed a huge folder, and upon opening it, I found the work of heritage consultant Meredith Walker on documenting the history of the aprons made by Macedonian women in Port Kembla, New South Wales. I asked staff to consider using the research project for a small exhibition as part of the Design Festival, together with a publication. There was some consternation, a wringing of hands about the time frame, and the issue of the subject matter being social history and not design. Staff and I then visited the women at the Macedonian Community Centre in Port Kembla. The women didn't speak English and had an average age of around 80. They sat on one side of the room and the men on the other side. We subsequently opened Ties with Tradition, Macedonian Apron Design, and the international design guru brought out for the Design Festival selected it as his favourite exhibition. At the exhibition opening, some 200 of the Macedonian community and friends attended. You could see the pride in the faces of the elderly men that they felt for their wives. I was told by some of the elders their young people, like many today, were not interested in maintaining their traditional practices. On that opening day, however, several of the younger generation, including a couple of young men who were training to be Defence Force pilots, proudly performed their traditional dances. As we had expected, there was some criticism of the use of the description Macedonian, and I'm sure the High Commissioner would understand this. However, we had chosen to maintain the integrity of the community's wishes. The exhibition and its publication brought happiness and a pride to a very, very depressed section of the Australian community, a deeper appreciation of the importance of maintaining aspects of one's heritage for the younger generation, and a realisation by museum staff the importance of not being afraid to moving the paradigm of how museums categorise objects and collections for exhibitions. You can read more about this exhibition and those involved, including the fabulous lead curator Lindy Ward and Rebecca Evans, by doing a search online. I've had many exciting and enriching jobs, but the best was being a museum director. As a director, you are surrounded by so many talented and committed staff. One such person at the Powerhouse Museum was Glenys Jones, whom I'm sure many of you will know. Islamic fashion was just one of a number of very interesting research projects Glenys had initiated. The banning of the burqa by France increased a smouldering discourse in Australia in relation to Muslims and Islamic teachings. We agreed the Powerhouse would present an exhibition subsequently called Faith, Fashion and Fusion. The exhibition explored emerging modest fashion market, and with it we'd hope to create a better understanding on why Muslim women chose to wear burqas and to dress modestly, and that other Australians had no need to be fearful. I cannot talk about building social capital without commenting on the terrible days after September 11. Many museums in the United States proved their worth as civic spaces. The museums of New York did more than offer a physical haven. The Brooklyn, Manhattan and Staten Island children's museums opened their doors free of charge to families and offered special programs which enabled children to reflect and express their feelings. Parents and teachers found ways to encourage cultural understanding at a time when children wanted to know who did it. Who were the bad people? They needed someone to explain the terrible instances of blame. and hatred they were seeing, directed against other kids at school or Middle Eastern shop owners. In the last few months in the United States, a museum group supported by the American Alliance of Museums organised a gathering of museum professionals under the banner of Museums and Race 2016 Gathering for Transformation and Justice. Their communique stated they shared the belief that despite more than a generation of effort, the persistent and pervasive presence of structural racism is at the heart of museums. Failure to diversify their board, staff, collections, members and visitors. Understanding and recognising structural racism is difficult and a potential contentious undertaking, but also a necessary step for the future of America's museums. I have sympathy with the views expressed by the museum group, and I strongly agree with Robert James' challenge to museums to addressing pressing societal issues, particularly climate change. And I also thought Elizabeth Merritt's provocation today was pertinent to the discussion. In the last couple of years, we have seen the rise of Reclaim Australia, the protest against the new mosque in Bendigo, and the sustained attacks on Adam Goodes, the Indigenous Australian rules football player. You can see I'm a rugby league person. In recent weeks, we saw the attacks of Waleed Ali and Lee Lin Chin as a result of them being nominated for the Logie Awards. There is little doubt that these attacks are on the basis of race. I did chuckle, however, not maliciously, when I read the attack on Waleed by another Muslim following his win, only for the reasons that it happens to our mob all the time. I may have missed them, but I can't recall any communique or opinion pieces initiated by museums speaking out on these issues or on the issue of constitutional recognition for Indigenous Australians. I haven't seen any programs offered to assist Australians understand why Indigenous Australians are seeking recognition in the Australian Constitution. I also didn't see any museum debates about whether or not the race power in Australia's Constitution should stay, or about the impact a dilution of the Racial Discrimination Act might have on minority groups of Australian citizens. I fully appreciate the focus is on the continuing budget cuts and concerns around the potential for negative publicity. Australia's history wars have done much to stymie the progress of museums addressing societal issues. The politicisation of museum board appointments can also be an impediment, consciously or otherwise, from museum staff undertaking their work, and in some cases potentially distorts the collections. The seminars, libraries and museums in an era of participatory culture held in Salzburg in 2011 identified that museums and library staff required professional development to enable them to transform their engagement with the community. Other recommendations include museums must recognise their internal processes, must reconfigure their internal processes so that working with communities does not equal institutional outreach ghetto, but is part of the institutional core. Recognition that while the accelerated movement of peoples across borders is increasing diversity, the disparity of economic and cultural opportunities is less tolerated. And I believe each and every one of us in this room fully appreciates that point. Museums must develop new evaluation tools so that quality and impact rather than quantity become the markers of success. I strongly agree with this point. It will require funds, but it's important if museums are serious about the quality of their work overall, including building social capital. Australian museums need to change a culture that is now driven by visitor numbers and actively pursue an agenda to address societal issues and engagements with all Australians equally, including those from various minority groups. You may be asking, why should museums and you as an individual play a role in building social capital? Well, I would suggest the reason is We all want our Australian society to function effectively and to mature as a nation. And quite frankly, I can't say it is currently. I strongly believe that museums, libraries, galleries are well placed to provide leadership on social issues. You are located in capital cities, regional centres and in remote locations. You are on the ground, particularly those in regional and remote locations, and can adapt programs in a way to carry out your work to suit the particular situation and the particular community needs. You can and should do this in a non-polemic way. Having limited funds is no excuse. You are currently a functioning and operating entity. In some instances, it may require you to change your priority or methods. Boards may be difficult, but don't despair. There are many strategies to enable you to work with your boards. Build this role into your vision or mission to drive cultural change within your organisation. The Monterey Aquarium was judged by its peers as the best museum overall some years ago. Their mission is simple but evocative, to inspire conservation of the ocean. A further suggestion is that Museums Australia might like to consider creating a couple of awards, one for the director who delivers the most all-round outcomes for a museum or gallery building social capital. This would include the leadership they have provided and the environment they have created to engender the building of social capital. The award could be biennial and would need to be significant to be taken seriously. I'm sure Red Cross or another like organisation with a major company would support such an award. To you as individuals, I say building social capital does not depend on where you work or whether or not you're at a senior level or a junior level, new or inexperienced. It does, however, take courage. It does take persistence and resilience. But you know what? I know that many of you have those qualities. There are many people who've inspired me and kept me going, but today I mention two, and I know many women, but I'm not going to name any of those today. Professor Graham Clark and the late Nelson Mandela. Professor Graham Clark developed and implanted the first bionic ear. Graham Clark always knew he wanted to do medical research to help his deaf father hear again. He stood on the street corners in the 80s with a bucket collecting money from passers-by. Graham's passionate pursuit to help the deaf also drew criticism from sections of the medical and the deaf communities. Some of the deaf community understandably felt threatened by a procedure which offered to take them, or perhaps their children, out of that community and into an alien world of hearing. But for people who suffer hearing loss suddenly through accident or illness and are miserably cut off from their family and friends, as well as from their work, the bionic ear is a genuine miracle, literally a chance of a new life. When Nelson Mandela won the election in South Africa to become its first black president, his first thoughts were not on the economy, they were on building social capital. I quote, "From the moment the results were in and it was apparent the ANC was to form government, I saw my mission as one of preaching reconciliation, of binding the wounds of the country, of engendering trust and confidence. I knew that many people, particularly the minorities, the whites, the coloured and Indians, would be feeling very anxious about the future, and I wanted them to feel secure. I reminded people again and again that their liberation struggle was not a battle against any one group or colour, but a fight against the system of repression." Well, I for one am looking for this kind of leadership in government and also in museums, libraries and galleries. Museums Australia and Museum Aotearoa have begun a very important conversation, so I encourage you all to continue and take action when you return home. Thank you. I'm happy to answer questions if you've got time, or if you're racing to get a beer, I understand that too.
We've got 5 minutes.
Yeah. So we'll just turn the lights on so I can see people. We can't see, so we need the lights on, I think. No. And you don't even have to ask a question if you want to make a raging comment or anything. I'm used to it. Feel free, as long as it's done in a nice tone. Don't think there's anyone. Okay.
Hi, Dawn. Do you think that having a national cultural institution that's for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia, developed by, established by, will help overcome some of these issues around meaningful recognition around the racism that's going on in the country at the moment?
No, I don't think that. I don't think it would. Only because, and I'm not saying I'm disagreeing with the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Culture Centre, because I think my thinking's changing on that, and I haven't yet quite figured that out. I think Australia is so vast as a geographical area, and that's why I think the network of museums and galleries that we have around the country on the ground is the way to go, because you have to educate and make people feel comfortable in some of those areas, and they'll vary, like, you know, Western Australia and Queensland, my own state, and Territory had some pretty, and Territory still has, sorry, Territory people, terrible ideas. So I think it's got to be right across the country, but I do believe strongly, and thinking about this over the last 12 months, that museums, galleries has a major role to play. Because people, whilst it wasn't, I used to preach and talk about museums as safe places. It was very unsafe for me, museums. However, I do think they will listen to people from museums and that. So I think it's got to be distributed, really. No more questions? No more comments? Okay.
Dawn, thanks for a great presentation. Just going back to your example of American museums, in a sense, coming out and saying, we're not yet doing things the way we'd like to in terms of racism. That's also a positive gesture. It's like a call for help.
Yes.
Yeah. Do you think that's a strategy that you could see would be useful in other parts of the world, or could you say a little bit more about using that example?
Yeah, well, I think there are a couple of things I like to see museums do. One is the continued cuts in the arts sector, and people would know that I keep trying to push our CAM group to, you know, have more communiques and all of that. So I think there are a couple of things that people collectively, and you heard it a bit this morning, need to get together. If you're speaking as one voice, then it's not so threatening as the individual director being threatened with non-renewal of contracts. But years ago, museums were expected, and people did send out communiques about things. So that needs to happen. And I think what's upset me over the last couple of years has been that it actually has been knowing racism that's happened in Australia. Now, it's all been covert, and if you go online, I gave a Mabo oration last year, and it was really distressing going through how everything has been a struggle. I knew it, but because you're dealing with it every day. But if you go through and see the history, in its recent history, that people have continued to not provide justice or equality based purely on race. So, and I do think museums, like the American museums, are crying out for help, and they're saying we should do something. I think it doesn't need to happen in Australia. I'm calling for what it is now. Maybe it's a twilight of my years or losing patience, but yeah.
Hi, Dawn.
Hi.
I've got more of a comment than a question, really, but I'm just wondering if there's maybe room for some of the strategies from social entrepreneurship in museums. So getting people to really be inspired on a grassroots level to encourage social change. And perhaps that's something museums can be endeavouring to teach.
Yeah, well, I think the other thing is that I think what was very good about the Faith Fashion Fusion exhibition was the Muslim community did all of that mostly, exhibition design, I think publication design, the design of etc. So I think people in museums need to be careful that they're teaching people. It's got to be much, and it can't be just consulting. It's got to be much more in depth with that. But I think also I think Peter White mentioned a good idea this morning about staffing, for instance. And I think museums is way behind private sector in terms of Indigenous areas where major companies these days, and I spoke to, I think about 300 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander undergraduates a couple of months ago. 300 are in the best law firms, the best accounting firms in this country. So I really am saying to you, and I know my colleagues, and they most probably said I didn't do enough. I tried to do quite a lot at the National Museum of getting Aboriginal people and Asian, reflecting the culture of Australia, not just on the floor, but throughout the whole organisation. You have to actively pursue it. But there's no reason why you can't get these days some key graduates coming out and appointing them, not just in the Indigenous area too. I have to say that I want some of our young, or not so young, Indigenous curators around New Zealand and Australia to be just not, their aspiration shouldn't be just about Aboriginal people only should look after the collections. I want to see some more directors, assistant directors, all through. Because really that's where you're going to be in a position to make decisions.
This is sort of a follow-up question, Dawn. I'm going back to your idea of giving an award to museums for building social capital. So you're on the judging panel. What are the criteria that you would put forward as measures of building social capital in a museum? Well,
that's why I said you should be a director. And it should be overall, like what, and I knew someone was going to ask this question, but I've got to do a bit of work on, not that I should be the one judging, but I think it has to be worked out because they must create, and it's not just about Indigenous, it's about a whole range of areas that I think there needs to be a criteria developed clearly, but it's about the environment they create. And because Museums Australia gives awards out on, here's a good exhibition, etc., and that's great. And certainly some of those PAHA ones got up and got awards, but if you're going to drive this stuff, you have to drive it as director, seriously. Otherwise, you might have very, very committed curators and other senior staff, but unless senior management's in tune with it and going to say, we're going to push this throughout the organisation, it just doesn't happen. So I don't know, I'd have to think about the criteria. But it has to be for the overall environment. It just can't be a one-off, is I guess what I'm saying. It's got to be ingrained.
Perfect moment to end, I think.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dawn. Kia ora.